Kennedy, 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 Kennedy for me. If you want a man who understands. You gotta like that Kennedy song, right? It's catchy, right? There's this real charisma to Kennedy. That's one of the main reasons that he wins. That song is so fun. Let's talk about some other reasons that Kennedy beats Nixon in 1960. We're at the top of the second page of the study guide, ladies and gentlemen. Second unit, or I beg your pardon, second video of Unit 9. I hope you're having a good night, rolling along here. Why else does Nixon lose to Kennedy? Number one, Kennedy plays the television role very well. This is the first televised presidential campaign, and when Kennedy goes in, he has spent the last week hanging out with his boys in Palm Springs. Deep suntan, handsome-looking devil. He gets on TV, and people are like, oh, I heart Kennedy. I heart him. Okay? Nixon, on the other hand, is a sweaty son of a gun. Doesn't wear any makeup. He's been campaigning like a dog because Eisenhower won't give him any support. We'll talk about that in a minute. And he spends all this time getting in there on ideas, and unfortunately on TV, Nixon just didn't look right. Now, you're going to say, wait a second, Holliday, this was about image? Part of it is, isn't it? Part of it has to be image. Okay, Kennedy gets on there and he looks a little bit better. People who read the transcript of the debate and didn't see the debate thought Nixon did better. People who saw the debate but didn't read the transcript thought Kennedy did better. That's about image right there. Number two, the Democratic coalition delivers. That same 1936 Franklin Roosevelt group of people, labor unions, African Americans, women, intellectuals, Jews, Catholics. Keep in mind, this is the first Catholic president. He's going to pull a lot of Catholic votes. I can guarantee that. As he makes his way across the country, Kennedy appeals to people and he convinces them that this is the new era. This is the youth that we need. Don't vote for Nixon. Nixon's kind of just Eisenhower a little younger. You know, Eisenhower's old, fuddy-duddy. We need something youthful, vivacious. Okay. On top of that, Kennedy goes out, and as I said, there's this huge charisma campaign in order to pull people into the election. And the last thing that we'll mention here is that President Eisenhower doesn't necessarily give his vice president that much love. Remember we watched that famous clip where they said, oh, we're wondering if you could give us one thing that President Nixon has advised you on. And in the back of your mind, you're going, come on, Eisenhower. Go to bat for your boy. Go to bat for him. 8 years as vice president. You probably sent him all the way around the world. Hey, Nixon, you're going to this funeral in Malawi. Or something like that. And what does he say? Well, if you give me about a week, I might be able to come up with one. A week. That's what you said? Cold. Cold. Okay? So Kennedy wins in 1960 and is inaugurated in 1961. I want to spend a moment here with what is really the promise of the age, this idea of Kennedy. People believed that they were ushering in something new and something fantastic. Part of the tragedy of the 1960s is Vietnam, for sure, which we covered in the last video. But the other part of it has to be this sense of loss, that the nation had something special, that in people like Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., that the nation was going in a direction towards great things, that it was going to be a fabulous future. And all three of the men I just mentioned meet violent deaths in the 1960s. The people who lived through this time are scarred by it. They have to be. These are the people they looked up to and their role models. They might have not known them on a personal basis, but they thought they knew them on a personal basis. They saw them as being the leaders of their society, and when they were gone, it left them feeling empty. Let's talk about Cuba. Both of the big foreign policy events we talked about for the Kennedy presidency really focus around Cuba. In the early parts of his presidency, Kennedy is really itching to let people know that he's an experienced, hardy Cold Warrior. Unfortunately for Kennedy, he's going to commit himself to a plan that doesn't have a lot of chance for success. During Eisenhower's time in the presidency, the CIA had developed this invasion scenario called the Bay of Pigs, where a group of Cuban refugees, Cubans who had left the island and were being trained in Guatemala by the CIA, would storm Cuba, overthrow Castro, reestablish the American sort of led dictatorship or government, at least throughout socialism, let's say, and by doing so, secure for the United States a solid win in the early days of the Kennedy presidency. If you're Jack Kennedy and you're 44 years old and you want to show the world that you're bold and you're new and you're young, but you're also not going to take communism 90 miles from the coast of Florida, you backed the plan, and unfortunately, the thing's a debacle from day one. Okay, the entire invasion looks horrific. It looks as though the United States really did not know what they were doing. Unfortunately, both Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, and Castro, who's the leader of Cuba, can look across at the United States and say, "What was that? What was that you just tried?" Okay? Unfortunately, it leaves Kennedy feeling let down and adds to the tension between the two men as they have meetings later on. Let's zoom ahead to the 1962, I beg your pardon, Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviet Union, in an attempt to establish a nuclear foothold, positioned warheads off of the coast of Florida, in Cuba, which really targeted about 90 million Americans. When we discovered the weapons silos, we did not know until years later that there were actually weapons there. So everything we did during the crisis, we did not knowing that the consequences could have been that much graver. See what I'm saying? We thought there might have been a strike from the Soviet Union. We did not know that there could have been a nuclear strike from Cuba that would have hit the United States. That would have been something. But this is the closest the United States comes to a nuclear war during this Cold War period. It really is touch and go. America's first step is to put an embargo on the island to try and assure that the missiles that we thought were being delivered on a ship called the Poltava don't get to Cuba. We also at the same time pull up a whole bunch of army men and get ready for a huge invasion of Cuba. Kennedy, I think, comes out ahead here. Kennedy looks down the barrel of war and manages to convince Khrushchev, listen, you don't want to do this. We have weapons in Turkey close enough to you to do some damage as well. You don't want to end the world, okay? You don't want to really blow society up. And in the long run, Khrushchev agrees that as long as the United States will take some of the missiles out of Turkey, that he will take the missiles out of Cuba, and the world stands down after 13 days of crisis. As I said, I think Kennedy comes out ahead here. Khrushchev is removed from power by the Soviet Committee shortly afterwards. He's replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. If you've never seen a picture of Brezhnev, dude looks like two very hairy caterpillars crawled on his head and camped right here. Biggest eyebrows ever seen. And if you went into a waxing place, the people would just fall over. They'd be like, we quit. There's nothing we can do. We quit. The point being, the Cuban Missile Crisis is really a high point for JFK. Unfortunately, next year, in 1963, he's dead. Let's look at some of the civil rights here. We talked about sit-ins. Sit-ins are a fantastic economic boycott technique where young African-American and later on whites as well would go into lunch counters and sit and refuse to order. And by doing so, they would really stymie businesses that had segregated lunch counters. This starts at Woolworths in North Carolina, but spreads to a lot of places throughout the South. Eventually, places get tired of the fact that they're not selling anything, and they have to bow down. It's beautifully done. This is organized by a group called the SNCC, the SNCCs, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committees, which are a branch off of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Easy for you to say. Okay. After that, some other big civil rights events of the days, the Freedom Riders, who are going to make their way through the South, challenging segregated busing laws in a lot of the states. There's violence in Alabama in particular, and President Kennedy steps in to offer federal protection and marshals to those bus riders to allow them to be able to go on their travels without the fear of harassment and brutality, as they saw in a number of places in Alabama. We then saw a video that we watched about the march in Birmingham, Alabama, which leads to a fantastic writing piece called Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. If you're looking for something to read, that's the document of the Civil Rights Movement right there. Why we can't wait. Why we can't sit and wait on this event. Okay, why you have to push these things. And even though the movement may be nonviolent, it's important that it's active and that it's trying to achieve something. All of this crescendos then in the 1968 I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King Jr. As I said in class, this is a high point and a low point. It's a high point in the sense that this is the pinnacle of the nonviolent civil rights movement. This is where Martin Luther King Jr.'s oratorical genius and his leadership potential is at its absolute highest. Unfortunately, the nation is headed down a very bumpy road. John F. Kennedy will be dead, sadly, within a few months. The nation will be off to Vietnam, and the 1960s that we know as being the turbulent 60s will begin. With it will come a demand for a much swifter progress towards civil rights. Groups that are not willing to be nonviolent and not willing to wait any longer will advocate for more violent and more angry policies towards society in order to gain civil rights. So for Martin Luther King Jr., this is the high point. His hold over the civil rights movement is never any higher than it was in that summer in Washington, D.C. Next, President Johnson.